In this video, we'll be exploring the growth of nationalism experienced by the U.S. following the War of 1812. The country had been tested by the most powerful nation on earth and survived. We had new heroes and a new vision led by a younger population. This period, known as the Era of Good Feelings, is one of expansion and growth. The average age in this period was 17 years old. The founding generation was quickly fading into the past. America was a young, vibrant country with young, ambitious men and women. The Republic had survived its most severe test. For a second time, it had won and claimed its independence from Britain. The War of 1812 is often referred to as America's Second War of Independence. This younger generation saw the vitality of a new country. They were not caught up in the political worries of structuring a government and arguing about power. The West offered unlimited potential, locked up in every American as well. Optimism reigned, boundaries were limitless, and in the process, Americans had put their past behind them, only to read and study about the Founding Fathers in books and paintings. A new era had begun, the era of the common man. The same folks who stood toe-to-toe with the British at New Orleans, Fort McHenry, Baltimore, and the West. These young men and women would write a new exciting chapter in American history. The Founding Fathers thought slavery would die out when the Constitution was written in 1787. But in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin and changed history. The cotton gin made slavery profitable. Plantations got bigger and more efficient. Planters bought more land, grew more cotton, and became big producers with slave labor. When a new variation of cotton was planted along the Gulf Coast in the 1820s, cotton became king. The South grew the crop the North needed to manufacture its textiles, as well as supplying Great Britain and their mills. The cotton gin freed up more slaves to work more land. In addition, the slave population grew as black slaves were also reproducing at a higher rate than replacement. What does the nation have to feel good about? The nation was tested and survived its second war of independence against Great Britain. It showed that there was no need for a large standing army. Civic virtue was alive and well. There was a drastic increase in nationalism following the victory at the Battle of New Orleans. The War of 1812 had caused the death of the Federalist Party, uniting the nation in a set of shared political views. We begin once again to expand west, pushing Indians west of the Mississippi River. This expansion creates an increase in Western power as more and more Americans move west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Treaty of Ghent gave the United States respect from foreign countries as we stood toe-to-toe with the most powerful nation on earth. The Embargo Act of 1807 forced Americans to look inward for manufactured goods, causing the beginnings of an industrial revolution. The war did, however, reveal glaring security weaknesses that needed to be addressed. Overall, this is a prosperous time in American history. The Panic of 1819 was the first major financial crisis in the United States. It signaled the transition from dependence on European markets towards a more independent economy. It was caused by adjustments in the global markets after the Napoleonic Wars, land speculation, and the use of paper money. The Second Bank of the United States was largely to blame because it severely reduced the amount of credit available in order to lower inflation. This led to foreclosures on farms and businesses. It also led to widespread bankruptcies and mass unemployment. This also marked the end of the Era of Good Feelings. The Era of Good Feelings marked a period of territorial expansion and the settling of boundaries. The Treaty of 1818 was an international treaty signed between the United States and Great Britain. The treaty allowed for joint occupation of the Oregon Territory for 10 years, which was able to be renewed. Both countries also agreed to a boundary between the United States and Canada at the 49th parallel. Finally, it granted shared fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. Spain was having difficulty controlling Mexico, who would gain its independence shortly. In the meantime, Spain had very few resources to keep order in Florida, which had become a haven for pirates, outlaws, runaway slaves, and Indian raiders. After the War of 1812, Jackson was sent to Florida to clean up Spain's mess. Spain was told, clean it up and keep order, sell it, or we're going to take it. They needed the money to put into their efforts to try to subdue Mexico, who was on the verge of revolution. They sold Florida to the United States. In return, we give up our claim to Texas, the that we had acquired when we purchased Louisiana from France in 1803. The Russo-American Treaty of 1824 established a border between the Russian territory in North America and the Oregon Territory. It established a southern border of 5440, protecting the Oregon Territory from Russian expansion. When the Missouri Territory first applied for statehood in 1818, it was clear that many in the territory wanted to allow slavery in the new state. Part of the more than 800,000 square miles bought from France in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, it was known as the Louisiana Territory until 1812, when it was renamed to avoid confusion with the newly admitted state of Louisiana. Missouri's bid to become the first state west of the Mississippi River and to allow slavery within its borders set off a bitter debate in Congress that was, like the nation itself, already divided into a pro- and anti-slavery factions. In the North, where abolitionist sentiment was growing, many people opposed the extension of the institution of slavery into new territory and worried that adding Missouri as a slave state would upset the balance that currently existed between slave and free states in the Union. Pro-slavery Southerners, meanwhile, argued that new states, like the original 13, should be given the freedom to choose whether to permit slavery or not. After this stalemate, McCulloch v. Maryland is one of the first and most important Supreme Court cases on federal power. In this case, the Supreme Court held that Congress has implied powers derived from those listed in Article 1, Section 8. The Necessary and Proper Clause gave Congress the power to establish a national bank. Furthermore, the court ruled that Maryland could not tax the national bank, that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. If the states may tax one instrument employed by the federal government in the execution of its powers, they may tax any and every other instrument. This was not intended by the American people. They did not design to make their government dependent on the states. In 1808, the government of New York granted a steamboat company a monopoly to operate its boats on the state's waters, which included bodies of water that stretched between states. Aaron Ogden held a license under this monopoly to operate steamboats between New Jersey and New York. Thomas Gibbons, another steamboat operator, competed with Aaron Ogden on the same route, but held a federal coasting license issued by an act of Congress. Ogden filed a complaint in New York court to stop Gibbons from operating his boats, claiming that the monopoly granted by New York was legal even though he operated on shared interstate waters. Gibbons disagreed, arguing that the U.S. Constitution gave Congress the sole power over interstate commerce. After losing twice in New York courts, Gibbons appealed the case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court determined that the Commerce Clause of the Constitution grants the federal government the power to determine how interstate commerce is conducted. Gibbons v. Ogden was a landmark decision in which the Supreme Court held that the power to regulate commerce included the power to regulate navigation. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was actually Britain's idea, as colonies throughout Central and South America began to rebel against their colonial rulers. Britain had invested a lot in their colonies and had a huge stake in controlling the trade, especially the sugar and cotton trade in the Western Hemisphere. They wanted an agreement to protect their economic interests. The U.S., on the other hand, did not want Britain dictating policy to the U.S. John Quincy Adams and Monroe liked the idea, but also wanted the agreement to apply to Britain as well as other European countries. Our interest wasn't so much economic as it was political. We wanted to protect the new fledgling democracies of the Western Hemisphere from the resurgent monarchies of Europe after Napoleon's downfall. We wanted governments that were republican in nature and not monarchies. We also feared the growing Russian presence on the West Coast, and if conflict came, we would need Britain's help. We would also need their help if a conflict developed in the Caribbean. Britain agreed to these terms. Number 1, no further European colonization of the Western Hemisphere. Number 2, the U.S. would not interfere in European affairs. Number 3, European countries could not interfere in the Western Hemisphere. This doctrine becomes the second cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. Washington's farewell address was the first cornerstone. As no presidential candidate had received the majority of the total electoral votes in the election of 1824, Congress decides to turn over the presidential election to the House of Representatives, as dictated by the 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The 12th Amendment states that if no electoral majority is won, Only the 3 candidates who received the most popular votes will be considered in the House of Representatives. Representative Henry Clay, who was disqualified from the House vote as a 4th-place candidate, agreed to use his influence to have John Quincy Adams elected. Clay and Adams were both members of a loose coalition in Congress that by 1828 became known as the National Republicans, while Jackson's supporters were later organized into the Democratic Party. Thanks to Clay's backing, on February 9, 1825, the House elected Adams as President of the United States. When Adams then appointed Clay to the top cabinet post of Secretary of State, Jackson and his supporters cited the appointment as the fulfillment of a corrupt agreement. With little popular support, Adams' time in the White House was largely ineffectual, and the so-called corrupt bargain haunted his administration. Finally, the United States presidential election of 1828 featured a rematch between John Quincy Adams, now the incumbent president, and Andrew Jackson. As incumbent Vice President John C. Calhoun had sided with the Jacksonians, the National Republicans, led by Adams, chose Richard Rush as Adams' running mate. Unlike the 1824 election, no other major candidates appeared in the race, allowing Jackson to consolidate a power base and easily win an electoral victory over Adams. The Democratic Party drew support from the existing supporters of Jackson and their coalition with the supporters of Crawford, the old Republicans, and Vice President Calhoun.